Welcome back to Women Writers in Chinese History. In this lecture, we'll discuss the tragic image of the young woman poet in writings from the 17th and 18th centuries. In the last video, we have discussed the emergence of family-based female literary networks and their indication of the new possibilities and new limitations for writing women in 17th century China and afterwards. Another trend that reveals these new possibilities and the limitations is the prominent literary image of a young and sensitive woman poet who suffers a tragic fate and often dies young. This development is reminiscent of the theme of the neglected lady in early poetry and reflects the tenets of the cult of Qin, that is the cult of love and sentimentality, which rose during the late Ming Dynasty. In 17th century China, the most popular image representing the suffering young woman poet was that of Feng Xiaoqing. Alongside Tang Xianzu's Peony Pavilion, Xiaoqing's story became another crystallization of the cult of Qin. Xiaoqing's story is included in a book titled History of Passion, compiled by the famous writer Feng Menglong. Some scholars have proposed that Feng Menglong wrote the story himself. Compiled in the spirit of the cult of Qin, History of Passion, or Qin Shi, is a collection of past stories about passion and emotion, or sometimes new stories presented as old ones. According to the story in Feng Menglong's book, Xiaoqing was a concubine of a scholar and was consistently abused by his main wife. In historical sources about actual female literary networks, we've seen very harmonious and supportive relations between women in the same household. In literature and stories, however, that's usually not the case. The main wife's image in the Xiaoqing story is quite similar to that of a virago, an image popular in fiction and drama during the time. Based on various evidences, Xiaoqing's story is likely a fictional account, despite being presented as a true story. You can read a full translation of her story in Redbrush. Now, just to highlight some features of her story, Xiaoqing's biography is filled with many poems supposedly written by her to vent her frustrations. Here is an example. My spring blouse, tears of blood spot the light gauze, blow them away to the house of the recluse Lin Bu, and the 300 blossoming plums on the ridge will immediately be turned into flowers of azalea red. 春山血泪点轻纱，吹入林圃处世家。岭上梅花300树，一时应变牡丹花。Tears of blood, 血泪, is a common symbol of passion in traditional Chinese poetry. Here the poem compares these tears of passion to the plum flower, which has been celebrated in the Chinese tradition for blossoming in winter amidst snow and ice, thus symbolizing ultimate integrity and purity, similar to the bamboo. Lin Bu, the recluse in the poem, was a Song dynasty scholar used to live in the same Jiangnan region, and was famous for his love of the plum flowers, which he claimed to be his wife. Finally, the flowers of azalea red is a type of pinkish flower known as dujuanhua, or nightjar flowers in Chinese. We have introduced the nightjar as a symbol of sadness for its sorrowful sounds. Meanwhile, since the nightjar and the nightjar flowers both characterize the springtime, they might connote a sense of rebirth following the winter image of the plum flower. What's interesting about Xiaoqing's image is that she's not characterized by love sickness or any emotional attachment to her husband. Rather, her story focuses on her solitary sorrows. For the most part, Xiaoqing suffered all by herself, and sometimes she seemed to be indulged in her own sorrows. Her story does refer to her communication with certain female friends, and includes a letter she wrote to one of her friends. The following lines, supposed to be written by her in the form of a yuan aria, indicates how she's different from a stereotypically lovesick woman, and how her sorrows and emotions serve to express her existence as a distinctive and independent individual. I do not want to be one of those lovesick Mandarin ducks. Do not think that I'm nothing but longing and yearning. All alone I think, all alone I ponder, and all alone I muse. My heart is still here, my soul is still here. I change my blouse and play with the double sash of my skirt. 原不是鸳鸯一派，休算作相思一盖。自私自解自伤凉，心可在，魂可在，着衫又捻双裙带。Xiaoqing is portrayed to suffer from a chronic illness. It might be tuberculosis from a modern medical perspective. Symptoms of tuberculosis conform to the characteristics of a certain romantic personality, according to the cult of Qing, making one melancholic, withering away, and sometimes coughing blood, which is a poetic symbol of passion. The story depicts her eventual death with the following dramatic details on how she insisted to leave her best image behind. Illness worsened, and she no longer ate or drank anything apart from a single cup of pear juice every day. She would nevertheless continue to prop herself up in bed with cushions, fully dressed in her most dazzling gown and beautifully made up. Occasionally, to while away the time, she would summon a blind woman to sing narrative ballads to her, to the accompaniment of the lute. Even when she was suffering frequent fainting spells, she would never lie down with disheveled hair. One day she told her old maid, "Go and tell that husband of mine, to whom I'm tied by bad karma, to find me a good painter." When the painter came, she ordered him to paint her portrait. When he was finished, she took a mirror and, after looking carefully at herself, said, "He has caught my formal likeness, but has not yet captured my spirit." She then laid the painting aside. When he had done yet another painting, she said, "The spirit is right, but my posture is too stiff. My eyes would seem to be expressionless, and my hands heavy when he looks at me. It must be because I'm posing too much." So she laid this painting aside as well, and told the painter to remain by her side with his brush and observe her as she ordered the maid about and talked to her, fanned the tea stove, sealed a letter, personally straightened the folds in her clothes, or mixed all the different kinds of colors for him, hoping in this way to inspire his imagination. When some time later the third painting was finished, it truly captured all of her charms, and with a smile she said, "That's it." After the painter had left, she placed the painting on an altar table in front of her bed, lit some incense, and preparing a libation of pear wine, said, "Xiaoqing, is this to be your karma?" She stroked the table, her tears pouring down like rain, and overcome by emotion, she passed away. She was only 18 years old when she died. The story ends by portraying Xiaoqing's husband's sorrows at her passing, and how he saved Xiaoqing's last two portraits from his virago wife, who burned everything left by Xiaoqing she could get hold of. Some of Xiaoqing's poems survived since they were written on sheets of paper she used to wrap up hairpins and other objects to give to her maid's daughter. Finally, the author describes how he interviewed Xiaoqing's maid and got to witness her second portrait. The concluding passage of the story goes as follows. The maid also said, the young lady loved to talk to her reflection in the mirror, and in the late afternoon sun by the flowers, when the mists had disappeared and the water was clear, she would gaze at her reflection in the pond and whisper as if she were conversing with her reflection. But after the servant girls once caught her doing this, she refrained from ever doing it again, although on her brow one could see a hint of distress, as if she were about to weep. Alas, it is impossible to count all those in this world who, like Xiaoqing, end up hapless despite their talents, and must tarry in the dust with only their reflections to pity them, before disappearing without a trace. Xiaoqing's behaviors as reported by her maid indicate traces of narcissism characterizing her romantic personality. The author's comments in the end, on the other hand, hints at Xiaoqing's allegorical meaning for male scholars who felt that they were underappreciated, similar to the image of the neglected palace women in early poetry. Dramatic details like those about Xiaoqing's portrait indicates the story's fictional nature. In fact, these details resemble a key plot in Tang Xianzu's Peony Pavilion, in which the heroine Du Liniang drew a self-portrait before her death, and later this self-portrait came into the possession of her dream lover. Xiaoqing's name is also deeply symbolic. The character Qing in her name is related to the character Qing, which means love, passion, and sentimentality. From all these signs, we may safely assume that she is a fictional image being created to reflect the tenets of the cult of Qing. All in all, Xiaoqing's image is representative of the idea of a beautiful woman having a quote-unquote thin fate, that is, 红颜薄命. This idea portrays women as the tragic victims of fate. However, Xiaoqing's image is also emblematic of an intense, even somewhat narcissistic individualism that is more complex than the stereotypical image of a lovesick woman. On the other hand, one possible historical basis for the image of Xiaoqing is the trait of the so-called skinny mares, 瘦马, for which the best-known area is where Xiaoqing's supposedly from, the city of Yangzhou in the Jiangnan region. Skinny mares is a reference to girls being raised and groomed for the concubine market. Often they were sold into the trade by parents or relatives having custody over them. Though Xiaoqing's story does not spell out her background, her experience does resemble that of a concubine who had received a literary education and was sold to her scholar husband as a skinny mare. In terms of social reality, likely numerous women were traded in the skinny mare market without leaving anything behind. However, in a narrative poem ascribed to a woman named He Guizhi, possibly from the late Ming Dynasty, we do get a rare example of the voice of a woman who had suffered as a skinny mare. You can read the full poem in red brush. Here to summarize, the author states that she was abandoned by her parents since young and sold at the age of 6 by evil relatives. Her new owner was a staff for an official living in Yangzhou. She was subjected to hard labor and mistreatment as a servant girl in the household. However, a year later, her owner's attitude changed, and they started to teach her in various arts, including playing instruments, games of cards, sewing, and embroidery. She was supervised by the head of the household and his wife, and was required to address them as father and mother. They were strict about her getting everything right when learning all the skills. The girl was told that she'll marry a noble prince, but then she was sold to an old man who had a government post and was already in his 60s. He purchased her as a concubine in order to have a son. Upon this point, the author He Guizhi thus laments on her sorrow fate. Alas, to no avail is my face as beautiful as a flower. Alas, in truth, my fate is like a leaf in the wind. Today these people still insist on calling me child, but tomorrow another family will call me concubine. This is why my heart is broken, and I sigh with sorrow. Late at night I wipe my tears as my innards are crushed. Had I known that my powdered face would be sold for gold, I would long ago have plunged into the moonlit Yangtze River. 可怜我貌空如花，可怜我命真如叶。今日人家呼作儿，来日人家呼作妾。以此伤心怨妇嗟，夜深眼涕肝肠裂。早知粉面换黄金，悔不当年坠江月。At the end of her autobiographical poem, He Guizhi condemns Yangzhou, a city known for its wealth and sophisticated urban culture, as a dark place for women, for its concubine market. Dissolved by tears, and still my grief has not stopped, but the Yangtze's floods will never flow back to the west. The ancients already deplored this stubborn custom. This is my advice to all the unmarried girls with rosy cheeks and dark hair. Make sure to never in a future life be reborn in Yangzhou. 泪零落，情未休，长江之水无溪流。风俗不改古人愁，寄与红颜绿发闺中女，来生世莫生扬州。What might bring a little solace to the reader of He Guizhi's story is this report from Red Brush. According to one account, He Guizhi's husband died within a year, after which his main wife took pity on Guizhi and allowed her to remain with her. Together, the two women dedicated the rest of their lives to Buddhist devotions. Finally, I'd like to bring your attention to another widely popular story in Qing Dynasty China. That is, the story about Shuang Qing, a peasant woman poet. This story is recorded in a book called Xi Qing San Ji, Scattered Records of Xi and Qing, written by a male scholar named Shi Zhenlin, who lived during the 18th century. Shi Zhenlin's book is a collection of personal essays written about his experiences and musings. Shuang Qing is the main protagonist of a long passage in the book, and she's mentioned in various other places of Shi's essays. Shuang Qing's story has been studied in English monographs, such as Paul Rob's Banished Immortal, Searching for Shuang Qing, China's Peasant Woman Poet. Red Brush contains a full translation of her main story. You're welcome to read the full story included in the optional readings from Red Brush. Here again, I'll just call your attention to some representative parts of her story. The story introduces Shuang Qing in the following words. Shuang Qing was a girl from Xiaoshan whose family had been farmers for generations. From birth, she exhibited an innate intelligence, and whenever she heard the sound of books being read, she would happily smile. When she turned 10, she started to practice needlework, in which she became exceedingly skilled. Her uncle on her mother's side was a schoolteacher who taught in a school located next door. When she heard him recite the texts he was teaching, she would secretly memorize them all, and in this way, she started to practice composing poems and the lyrics instead of doing her needlework. She also learned the little seal style of calligraphy. Her dots and strokes were correct and charming, and she was able to write out the entire Heart Sutra on a single osmanthus leaf. When one of the neighbor girls married a student, she made fun of Shuangqing because, having been born in a peasant family, she could never hope to even look upon the face of a student. The Heart Sutra is a famous Buddhist sutra having 260 characters total. We must wonder how one could fit all these characters on a tiny leaf with elegant calligraphy. It should be noted that writing or engraving tiny characters was a special technique during the Qing dynasty, and we can witness that from many objects from the period. For instance, on this ivory piece engraved with the image of the 7 sages, there are 999 tiny characters on top telling the stories of these sages. Usually, craftsmen capable of the technique had to learn it for many years and use special tools such as magnifying glass. So we may continue to question how Shuangqing was capable of doing this without any special training or instruments. However, for readers of the time, this detail must have added interest and mystique to her story, making her talents more extraordinary and her story more tragic. Later on, we'll see repeated references to how Shuangqing wrote her poems on leaves using powder so that not to leave any traces behind. Shuangqing married an illiterate and coarse peasant of the surname Zhou when she turned 18. Shi Zhenlin, the author of Shuangqing's story, reports their encounter in the following words. Last summer, in the 4th month, I escaped the heat by going to live in a hall of paired plowing in Xiaoshan. My friend, the lover of flowers, Duan Yuhan, also showed up there. When I accompanied him to have a look at the evening hills, Shuangqing happened to appear outside her door with a spade in her hand. She was also carrying a bamboo basket and was preparing to plant melons and gourds on the river bank to the west of the bridge. Her expression was cheerful, but not without a trace of sadness. The next day we found one of her lyrics to the melody of Sands of Washing Brook, which she had written with powder on the leaf of an herbaceous peony. It read, "The warm rain, which has no feelings, comes down in threads. The herd boy has stuck a tender flowering branch aslant in his hair. This is when the new wheat is brought in from the small fields. Planting melons and drawing water, I'm blamed for being too early. Boiling the millet despite the morning mist, then they call me lazy. While all through the long, long day, my tender back aches in pain." 暖雨无情漏几丝，牧童斜插嫩花枝。小田新麦上场时，汲水种瓜偏怒早，忍烟吹暑又喷池。日长酸透软腰肢。Later, the author and his scholarly friend learned more about Shuangqing from an old man who was her neighbor. In his words, Shuangqing has a carefree nature and a friendly disposition. Lightly floating, she has the air of soaring beyond the clouds, with none of the trivial and niggling mannerisms of women. She considers her talents a bane, and those who visit her home never see a trace of her brush and ink. She is married to a peasant whose poverty is extreme, and on top of that, her mother-in-law works her very hard and shows her no compassion. Yet Shang-Qing serves her well, and even though she doesn't love her husband, she always puts on a happy expression when she sees him. Even though she may be burdened and emaciated by starvation and toil, she still continues to laugh and joke. The author and his friend became increasingly interested in Shang-Qing. In return, Shang-Qing sent a secret letter to the author's friend with a portrait of herself and a lyric poking fun at him, which indicates her lively personality despite all the hardship. Through further communications, the author learned that she was chronically suffering from malaria fever and still had to toil in hard labor as an impoverished peasant woman. As the author reports in the following passage, at the beginning of the 9th month, Shang-Qing's malaria still had not subsided. At that time, people were harvesting the rice, so she forced herself to go out and start working again. In the fields, she bundled the cut stalks, bending down low, then lifting them up high, then drying them, then stacking them. Whenever she grew dizzy with exhaustion, she would sit down on a pile of straw, but as soon as she had recovered, she would get up again. When one of her women neighbors urged her to stop, she tearfully said, "My husband leaves the house early with his sickle in his belt, walking on the frost with his bare feet and cutting his toes and ankles in order to slave in the fields. How could I allow myself to sit at ease and watch him? My mother-in-law is old and still takes part in the work. Moreover, how could such a poorly fated person as myself dare compare herself to those rich and noble girls who fear both wind and sun and avoid dust and grime?" The women neighbors all sadly sympathized with her. In this passage, in Shang-Qing's own voice, the author describes her as a poorly fated person, literally someone having a thin fate, 薄命, similar to the image of Xiaoqing. However, here her story took place in the setting of the impoverished peasant class, a setting that is quite rare for either actual or imagined women poets in the tradition. The author then spends many passages painting details of Shang-Qing's complex personality. These details express Shang-Qing's delicate disposition, yet also her wittiness and humor, as well as her loyal character that led her to remain faithful to her husband, who sometimes mistreated her in the following manner. One day, when Shang-Qing was pounding rice, she was out of breath and she rested with the pestle in her arms. Her husband thought she was being lazy and gave her a push. When she collapsed by the side of the mortar, the pestle fell on her and crushed her back. She cried out, but despite her pain, got up and resumed her pounding. While her husband angrily glared at her, she apologized with a smile. This rice really deserves a beating. So Shang-Qing answered her husband's abuse with an apologetic joke. The story includes further details on how Shang-Qing's being mistreated and sometimes starved by her husband and mother-in-law. Yet at one point, she finally broke down when being teased by a woman neighbor about her sufferings with the following complaint. "Heaven, allow me, Shang-Qing, to suffer this endless suffering on behalf of all the exceptional beauties of the world, so that beauties may never in all eternity be forced to live as I am living." Later, the story includes a letter Shang-Qing wrote to her uncle on her sufferings. The letter ends with the following passage. "As I am lacking in virtue, I cannot but feel resentment. But even though I feel resentment, I'll never go so far as to hate my husband. Of that I'm confident. Long ago, Xiaoqing wanted to not be reborn in heaven, but instead to be reborn as a double lotus. I want in my next life to be reborn in the body of a man, in order that I may practice the chant of a broken heart and recite gathas that dissolve the soul. That would be enough for me. Here, Shuangqing refers to the earlier Xiaoqing as sharing a similar fate as her, and imagines reincarnation and Buddhist devotion as the means to help her escape from the sufferings as a peasant woman in a future life. Suppose the Shuangqing's letters is once again written on a piece of leaf with powder. Here the author thus explains this practice. Whenever Shuangqing would write a poem or lyric, she would write it not on paper but on a leaf, using powder rather than ink. The leaves would quickly decay, and because it was not mixed with glue, the powder would easily fall off. She did this because she did not want to leave behind any trace of her writing. The story continues the themes on Shuangqing's suffering throughout many passages. For instance, it reports how Shuangqing's locked up by her husband after she admonished him for his gambling, and how she then wrote a poem on the fading lamp symbolizing her own fate. Even though the image is ominous, the second half of the lyric indicates that she still has a tiny spark of hope. Like a tiny star, slowly waning, it doesn't move. Still, I hope it will continue to burn, and perhaps give off some sparks. You are much better than that wildly swaying fisherman's lamp tossed by the winds. Alas, since the autumn moths have flown away, my illness has returned. When will it ever recede? For a long time, we gaze at each other, until I finally doze off, only to be startled awake. 星星见微不动，望你烟间。有个花生，胜野塘风乱，摇曳于灯。辛苦秋娥散后，人已病，病减何会？相看久，朦胧成睡，睡去空惊。Still later, the author narrates how he once contemplated about burning his story about Shuangqing, since readers would invariably question its veracity. Furthermore, in the more conservative culture of the Qing period, those who upheld orthodoxy would think it scandalous for a woman to let her writings circulate in the public, especially those about her innermost feelings. The story then includes a strongly worded letter sent by Shuangqing after she learned about the author's deliberation. In this letter, she first cited how Confucius, the sage himself, preserved love poems in the classics he had compiled in order to pass on more complex examples of his teachings. She then criticized conservative scholars through the image of a certain village schoolteacher who does nothing but shower the page with his spittle, the foam from his mouth soaking his beard. Finally, her letter concludes with the following passage. It is not my way of acting to be pure in words but sinful in behavior, to be negligent in my language and like a windlass in my actions. If this book be better consigned to flames, then I, Shuangqing, should never have opened my mouth. A butterfly does not speak, and yet desires the flowers. A maggot does not speak, and yet is addicted to dung. Those who in this world deceive others by not speaking of butterflies when they encounter fragrance, but turn to maggots as soon as they encounter them. Whenever I, Shuangqing, see these kinds of people, my malaria flares up. The metaphors in this passage are somewhat enigmatic, but Shuangqing's anger at the possibility that her story would be burned is obvious. Likely, she's implying that by not leaving her words behind, any interpretation of her character will be up to the reader, and given her lowly position, likely she'll be subjected to the worst interpretations. Upon receiving this letter, the author made up his mind to publish Shuangqing's story and describe his thoughts on Shuangqing in the following words. Now Shuangqing was like a dream. What one encounters in the dream is all topsy-turvy and confused. But when one wakes up and thinks about it, there is no need to feel any remorse. Whether people know me for my true worth or condemn me does not entirely hinge on this. Dream is a common metaphor for fiction. Many details from Shuangqing's story, such as her writings on tiny leaves using powder, also led us to question if her story was completely fictional. If that's true, Shuangqing's image is but another creation of a male scholar following the cult of Qin. Even so, Shi Zhenmin's writing is notable for its vivid, minute details and its depiction of Shuangqing as a complex character. Although written in classical Chinese, his writing reads more like a piece of modern fiction. On the other hand, after field research in Shuangqing's putative hometown in the Jiangnan region, some scholars have argued that there was a real Shuangqing in history. Even if some details in Shi Zhenmin's story could be fictional, his account was based on the image of an actual peasant woman poet. If that's true, Shuangqing is certainly one of the most notable woman writers in Chinese history for crossing not only a gender barrier, but also what appeared to be an insurmountable class barrier in traditional China. On this note, let's conclude this lecture. This is the last video of the week. Please complete the quiz questions and the pre-class reflections. Next week, we'll continue the theme of peasant women's writing by looking at the case of women's script literature.